This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Dahlia Shenlin. Gilad is away again, but don't worry, he'll be back soon. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like and find fascinating. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we're counting on you. I'm very excited today to welcome Benjamin Moser. He's the author of a number of books. The first one is Why This World, a biography of Clarice Lispector, for which he received Brazil's first state prize for cultural diplomacy. He's published translations from French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch. He's a former books columnist for Harper's Magazine and the New York Times Book Review. And he's also written for the New Yorker, Condé Nast Traveler, and the New York Review of Books. He won a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2017 and will be discussing his latest book, Sontag, Her Life and Work. It was published by Echo in 2019, and it won the Pulitzer Prize in 2020. Benjamin is speaking to us today from Utrecht, Netherlands. Thank you for being on the show, Benjamin.
Nice to be here.
Great to have you. Your book is a long, sprawling, but extraordinarily readable book. And I had to really try to step back. And I found myself asking if there is a unifying theme to the life of Susan Sontag, or at least in your image of her life that runs throughout her work. Could it have something to do with the gap between image and representation that seems to define her personal and intellectual struggles in your telling?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the difference between the mind and the body and the combat that they find themselves in, which is also a philosophical question, which is something that I wrote about in my biography of Clarice Lispector as well, which is the difference between language and reality, which is something that you can trace back very far. You can trace it back in the Jewish tradition as far as you want to. You can trace it back in the Greek tradition to Plato. And it seems sort of abstract in a way until you find somebody like Sontag, who's so fascinating because in a lot of ways, she in her daily life and in her writing and in her relationships acts out this combat between the brain, the person of culture, the person of learning, the person of education and language, and the actual physical body in all sorts of forms. And so that theme really, I didn't totally expect to find it again in a different guise than I had in the Clarice Lispector book, but there it was.
Did you feel like it was an oppositional struggle, a binary struggle between who she was either physically and in her personal life, which is a big part of your book, versus her intellectual life? Or was there integration? Could you see the overlap?
Yeah, you can always see the overlap. I think that this is something pretty familiar to all of us. You know, we exist in a mind of our own creation of this very humanized world that we create for ourselves, that our families and our cultures create for us, versus the body that does what it's going to do, whether it develops a huge zit on your face, or whether it gets cancer, or whether it makes you gay and you don't want to be gay, whether it makes you handicapped, for example. I mean, your body isn't really, it's not really the subject of your mind, although it can be, as we know from all sorts of things, that you can change the mind through the body and vice versa. But it's a very complicated relationship, and it's something that really, the more I write about it, the more I'd like to write another book about it in some other way, because it's just such a complicated subject.
Well, of course, we would love to read that book, I'm sure. I mean, the temptation of a biographer, I think, is always to read a linear trajectory into the early life of the subject and say, oh, this person was fated to become who he or she was. Where did you see the roots of who Susan Sontag became in her early life? Or did you find aspects of her early life that were incongruous with who she became over the years?
Well, a lot of people say to me, I can't believe this woman who was the symbol of Manhattan and the symbol of sophistication came from this very kind of middle class, fairly boring provincial background. But then I think, like, has anybody ever been in New York? Like, everybody in New York is from Omaha or from Guatemala, or, there's a valedictorian from some little crappy high school in some province. I mean, that's what makes New York, is it attracts all these people who wanted to get away from somewhere.
Thanks a lot. Some of us actually are from New York.
That's true, but I bet your ancestors were going there.
They're from somewhere else, including one of them from Omaha.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, I mean, it happens, and so but that's the dynamic of all great cities. And that's why they become what they become, is because they attract these kind of people. For Sontag to come from really middle America, and since I assume a lot of the people listening are Jewish here today, it was not the typical Jewish background of her time, because actually, although her grandparents were born in Europe, her grandparents all came to the United States as little children. So whereas a lot of the great Jewish writers of her generation, she's born in 1933. She is born the same month that Hitler comes to power. And, most of those people were the children of immigrants, and they were poor. And they wrote about, Williamsburg or, Flatbush, or these kind of areas where the Jewish proletariat came, and then the kid becomes a dentist. This is Philip Roth, this is Saul Bellow, this is all the famous Jewish writers. Sontag really came from middle America. Her parents spoke English without an accent, so did her grandparents. This was kind of an unusual background, actually. So in a certain way, she does have more in common with maybe Jewish people today who would come from, who'd be from Phoenix and would move to New York rather than from Poland.
Okay. And was there anything about her early life that, allowed you to really see the roots of who she would become intellectually?
Yeah, I think that if you know Middle America, especially then, before there was a Starbucks and a Borders and everything and Amazon to give you anything you wanted, you know how culturally impoverished a lot of these places were. And so when she was living in Arizona and in Los Angeles, which is sort of surprising, but 100 years ago, Los Angeles was a pretty provincial place. You realize how much this hunger for culture could exist in a place like that, and how much somebody like her would have felt alone in those places. And she was very unhappy in her family. Her father died when she was 5, in China, of all places. And her mother was an alcoholic who kind of checked out whenever things got complicated. And she just had this absolutely ferocious desire to be at the center of things.
Well, that's partly what I was getting at. I mean, you do shine a spotlight on her profound insecurities, and it's not hard to see where they came from, I think, in your rendition of her childhood with the narcissistic alcoholic mother, the loss of the father, the fact that early on she identified her own lesbian interests, and she was a very precocious intellectual, meaning she would have been the youngest person in the room a lot of the time. Never mind being a woman, which would have been unusual in the circles she was running in. So do you think that her suffering and probably isolation in that sense is partly what drove her ambition and her larger than life personality later? I was just thinking about the fact that today many of those experiences wouldn't be nearly as isolating, but at that time they really were.
You would have been able to be in touch with people. You would have been able to travel more easily. Travel is much cheaper than it used to be. Even in the United States, the country is not as big. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, the ambition that she feels very young, and she writes about it very candidly, even when she's a girl, in middle school. Her diaries start, I think, when she's about 12 or 13, and then she goes all the way through to the end of her life. That desire to get away is very, very powerful. And the feeling of being an outsider as well. Interestingly, it's very rarely, if never, couched in the terms of being Jewish. It's very often couched in the terms of being a lesbian, being a provincial. She's very aware of herself as someone from the provinces, and I think that ambition not only gets her through her life, but it makes a lot of the work that we find so intriguing, because her work is very hard, and you feel this when you read it. You feel like there's a great effort being made here. That she's not a natural talent in a certain way. She's naturally very brilliant. But she's not really a natural writer. She's not really a natural artist. She's somebody who is extremely attracted to literature and art and wants to find a way. And she's never sure about the way she's finding. So she's always reinventing herself.
It's fascinating. I mean, since you mentioned that the sexuality issue really was a defining tension from early on rather than something like her Jewishness, I found myself at points comparing and contrasting her with one of her contemporaries at University of Chicago, Philip Roth, whom you mentioned, because, the interesting contrast is that his sexuality was rather infamously everywhere, bursting out in his writing, if you will. And hers was a matter of such self-loathing that she struggles with it throughout her writing. It's not the entertaining neurosis, not to be unfair to Roth, but just to quickly characterize it. But it's really almost, at points, you describe it as rather like a self-imposed conversion therapy that she tried to do by integrating into heterosexual life. Was it simply that much harder to be a woman and a lesbian than a joyously heterosexual male in this time? And is that another driving factor of her internal tensions?
I mean, maybe. I don't know. I don't know specifically about a woman, because I think a straight woman, that's a very different experience, because straight women had their own challenges, of course, but that was something that wasn't a shameful thing. I mean, women were just women and that was it. Whereas with lesbians and with gay people in general, that was absolutely her quest to convert herself to heterosexuality, which starts very young. She decides to just start sleeping with a lot of men until she likes it. And of course, she never really likes it, because that's just not how it works. I find that very painful to read about and very sad, because she is only really doing what she's been told to do. I mean, she's not going against the culture. She goes against the culture in all these other ways. But in that way, for a girl born in 1933 who discovers she's gay, when she's pretty young, I think she's about 14 or so when she first mentions it in her journals, she was acting out something that would have put her into a position of an adversarial position with her entire family, with her entire society, with her entire world. And it would have absolutely been a choice to emphasize, to dig deeper into the isolation and the marginalization, which she had rejected very specifically. She did not want to be marginal. She didn't want to be living in a cul-de-sac in Arizona. She wanted to be at the center of things, and to be gay was to place yourself out of the center of things, even in New York.
There are a lot of references in the book throughout to unpublished memoirs, journals, unpublished, something you call autobiographical stories. And I feel like there's a game of hide and seek between her and herself. What is the difference between those things? And is that really part of this kind of insider-outsider, in a very profound way, identity that she had?
Oh, yeah. It's fascinating how much she puts of what she calls Sue. It's Sue versus Susan. She put Sue into her journals, and there's 100 volumes of these journals. And there's all this other unpublished stuff as well that's really interesting. And she really, she does this very consciously. Sontag is nothing if not smart. She knows exactly what she's doing. And the way that she kind of keeps herself alive psychically is to preserve this sort of secret part of herself in this private writing. And so for me, when I'm writing this book and researching it, it was completely fascinating to see just how powerful her public presentation was. It was really very rarely, even in her emails, which she starts doing at the end of her life, there's never an unkind word. There's never anything that's not extremely polished in there. And yet she puts all of her chaos and her messiness into these journals. So it's really great as a biographer to be able to see that, because if you only had the external stuff, you really would have had a hard time knowing who she was.
Well, not to get too up close and personal, but in your rendition of her journal, in your recreation of her journals, they sound pretty self-conscious as well. And she often refers to herself in the third person. And as a journal writer myself, I feel like that's the one place where I know nobody's ever going to see it. But it seems like she always had her mind on who would be seeing those journals and seeing herself through that hypothetical person's eyes. Is that correct? Is that a mischaracterization?
Yeah, it's sort of funny. She says that. I mean, she even addresses her biographer when she's like 16 or 17. She says she hopes somebody's going to come along and read this and kind of understand who she really was. And so you have this consciousness of greatness from very young. She knows that she's somebody and she's going to be somebody, and then she becomes somebody very young. And she's extremely self-conscious, and I think that was a kind of hygiene for her. Like, she could be this diva, she could be this grande dame during the day, and then she could come home and kind of, in a way, get in touch with some other side of herself. It's quite painful to realize that this didn't really work. Because in a lot of her life is a story of broken relationships, broken friendships, shattered intimacy, pain, sexual pain, physical pain, cancer. I mean, it's very hard. You get a sense when you're flipping through these journals of somebody really trying to stay alive.
Yeah, we're going to get into some of those relationships, but I do want to start to, focus a little more on her thinking, because we've talked about her life so far. And this is, of course, the tension in your book between who she is as a person and what she thought and wrote about. I was thinking about trying to draw, if I had to draw an arc of her thinking based on your book, it seems like earlier in her career, at one point, I think it's in the 1960s, you write that she had a preference for the abstract over the concrete, or as her friend Herbert Marcuse pointed out, quote, she could make a theory out of a potato peel. But then in later decades, she seemed to move into very concrete and immediate things, commenting on war, conflict, political life, of course, disease, as well as democracy. Is that a change in her thinking, or is it a fulfillment of the, maybe a transition into a public intellectual engagement?
Well, she had always wanted to do it. She just didn't know how. I mean, so when she's 13, I guess, or 12, she sees the first Holocaust pictures, which was a book that was published by the United States Army of Bergen-Belsen. And this showed up in Santa Monica, California, which, if you know anything about Santa Monica, California, it's about the most ideal sort of palm tree beach American thing you can imagine. And you can imagine what a eruption this would be in this girl's life. And she starts writing about it and starts thinking about how can she do anything. And I think writers often feel that writing isn't really doing, making your little sonnet or your whatever, your poem or your painting. I mean, okay, it's fine, but it doesn't really help anything. So what do you do as atomic bombs are falling and the Amazon rainforest is being hacked down and, you're sitting at your computer? This is a really classic question. And she didn't really know how to do it. And I think that was very touching about her in a way, because it's something that's I think nobody really knows how to do it. And often writers and artists get politics wrong because they're too focused on aesthetics. And politics is not aesthetic, just like sex is not aesthetic. It can be aestheticized. You can make a movie about the West Wing or whatever, but that's not the same thing as actual intervention. So she's groping her way. You feel her starting, with World War II. When she's a little girl, she has a newspaper that's very cute and very precocious, telling people about the events happening in the Pacific and in Europe. And then she moves into this engagement with, and then, the Nazi story that impacts everybody. And then the real disillusion of Cuba, which was very important in her generation. And then the real disillusion, which is Vietnam. And every time, she goes to Vietnam, she almost gets killed in Vietnam. She risks her life for that. But she never really figures out how to do it because it's just too abstract. And she's more comfortable in the realm of abstraction and ideas. But that's one of the things that's so great for me and for her about Bosnia, is that she finally figured out, what can an artist really do to help people in the real world here and now.
Was Vietnam a turning point for her, moving from that more abstract thinker to a concrete, very engaged public thinker? An activist, of course.
Yeah, I mean, because Vietnam is the moment where that generation of kids who grows up during World War II and who sees America as the last great hope of the world, and the American army as the great liberating force that it was in World War II. And they see this thing that they've been brought up to love and cherish and respect become this kind of genocidal monstrosity. And that's emotionally, not only politically, it's emotionally very, very hard for people to take on board, I think, in a way that now it isn't, because people are much more cynical. But she goes to Vietnam, she writes these pieces, she gets in a lot of trouble, a lot of people on the Upper West Side are yelling at her. But, this is, again, it's very, she was hardly the only person that was anti-Vietnam. I mean, most people were anti-Vietnam, and certainly everybody in her social or political or intellectual world. But there's a great disillusionment after Vietnam, because it kind of drags on forever and ever, and then it sort of peters out eventually. But there's not a sense, and I think it's very similar to the time that we're living in America now, is there's not a sense that anything good has been restored. It's like, okay, well, we got rid of Trump or we got rid of Vietnam, but we don't get back our self-belief. And we actually get more frustrated. Sontag becomes quite depressed in the 70s after Vietnam. And I think that was part of it, is just like what she's looking for, something that she can actually really believe in.
Yeah. Well, going back to that moment when she sees the photographs, I mean, let's talk about her critique of photography, which has become really such a seminal work in the thinking about photography and the meaning of photography in terms of public issues. Maybe try to bring together what you mentioned before, which is what happens to her in Bosnia. So can we draw a line between her seeing these photographs, starting to think about, the impact of representation of atrocities and horrors, and then maybe the evolution of her thinking when she comes to Bosnia, and you write that she has a new understanding of what photography can bring to public awareness?
Well, she had been from the time she sees the first Holocaust photograph, she's absolutely riveted by photography, and particularly the relationship of photography to cruelty. Is it ethical? Is it right to show these pictures of these dead people, often naked and anonymous and deformed in all sorts of hideous ways? Is it okay to sell that in a bookstore in Santa Monica? This is a very creepy kind of question once you start thinking about it. And in Vietnam, she sees, though, how pictures can have an impact in shaping the consciousness of the body politic that then ultimately, in very elliptical ways, can actually make an impact in the real world. So if everybody in America is aware of what happens in Vietnam, then maybe eventually, perhaps, there will be enough pressure on the politicians to stop this thing. But at the same time, she really thinks, I think her real impulse is that photography is grotesque and that it's exploitative and that it's creepy. And so On Photography comes out of this love-hate relationship. It's published in 1975, and I think it is which is a year the Vietnam War ends. And it's a reflection on how do images pervert us and how can they possibly save us? And it's such an interesting book because it's just fantastically written, and you just can't believe how much she knows and how many photographs she's actually thought about and how she can classify things and put them all together.
And I have to say, that's just to interject, that's when I'm thinking of that book, I was a little surprised when you said she doesn't seem like a natural as a writer, because I do find it incredibly readable.
Oh yeah, but she's almost 40, or she is 42 by then. She has a lot of false starts. I think a lot of writers do. No, that's an incredible book. I think maybe what I mean about not natural writer, her real ambition was to be a novelist. And that was something that was constantly frustrating to her because she felt like she never really, she did a little bit toward the end of her life. But no, that's Sontag at her absolute best. It's very rhetorically powerful. And you come away from it really, really worried about the fact that you even own a camera. You feel like a lecher, you feel like a voyeur.
Or a vulture.
A vulture, yeah. Or a camera is
photojournalists
a loaded gun. But then to make the connection to Bosnia, so she, about 20 years later, a little less than 20 years later, she ends up in Sarajevo at the height of this horrible siege, which is the longest siege in European history, in modern history. And she sees just how self-sacrificing photographers were. She sees just how imbued they are with a sense of mission and a sense of the importance of getting the word out. This is a time before the internet. It's just before the internet. And there's hardly any electricity in Bosnia. It's very hard to get any sort of news out of there, and it's besieged. And she sees that this same operation that condemns people and that can turn them into grotesque mockeries of themselves can also be used in this very positive way. And so one of the great things about Sontag that's so fascinating when you read her entire work, I hope when you read my biography, you get a sense of this, is how often she changes her mind. People had a real sense of her as this kind of Statue of Liberty, that just was standing there and never changed. She was this big monument. When in fact, when you read her work, she's constantly arguing with herself. And so the history of, it's not just the history of photography that's interesting, or the history of photography and violence and war that's interesting, but it's the history of Sontag's relationship to this stuff, but also to what she herself has thought about it previously.
I'm a little surprised to hear you say that people had that perception of her. It didn't occur to me because I see her as somebody who spans many fields. So not only is she arguing with herself, but she's writing about many different fields. And I'm really torn about whether to ask you more about her changing politics or move on. But let me just ask you for 1 minute. You do write about her break with the left, and she did run in pretty radical left-wing circles, certainly in the 70s. And then later on, basically says communism is fascism, and you actually portray her as having a break with the left. What did that come to mean?
I think it meant ultimately not very much. I think that this was a very, so I'm from Houston, Texas, and this was a very New York kind of thing. And it's funny that I found a story in there about Houston versus New York. She has this quote unquote break with the left. She says all these things that were actually, I was always really trying to understand that. I mean, so I grew up in a Jewish family in Texas, where everybody was left wing. Everybody agreed on, the same things that most sort of left wing Jews agree on in America. But there was no suspicion of communism. I mean, communism just never would have crossed anybody's mind in Houston. And so she has this big blow up, which a lot of it, it was a real hard thing for me to understand, even like why people had been so attracted to communism, even after everything was known about Stalin and about all the abuses and the horrors of that. I really didn't understand that. I thought it was obvious that even if it's not the same thing as fascism, it's still really awful in a lot of ways. And then she comes to Houston and she tries to sort of talk about it in this very elite Houston audience. I know exactly the room where she did this because I've spoken there myself in the Museum of Fine Arts. And what people in Houston were interested in was the visit of Princess Margaret the week before.
Who wouldn't be?
That's America. People aren't really, there's not an audience for communism in America except among a very small group of intellectuals in New York. And that was also changed. So this quote unquote break from the left, I find it a very interesting topic because it's hard for me to talk about. I think I've become much more radical in the last few years than I was. Even when I wrote the book, I think that I don't consider myself a liberal anymore. And I praise her in the book for her embrace of liberalism, because I think that certain liberal values, her defense of Bosnia, her defense of Salman Rushdie, her defense of writers in China, all sorts of causes that I also support, her her condemning of apartheid. But at the same time, now that every form of thought in America, at least that's in power, is some form of left liberalism, which has become very corporate and very neoliberal. I miss someone like Sontag. I like the radical Sontag. I like the people who just want to burn the whole thing down. We don't have that. We just have, there's no real space for anything outside of this very, very narrowly prescribed quote unquote center.
Okay. Well, I want to talk about a couple more things that I just have to get into this interview because they're too interesting to jump over. And one is Illness as a Metaphor, which I do think is one of her most influential books. And you explain that she sought to sort of divest disease of meaning and strip cancer of metaphors. Why? And how was that based on her personal struggle with cancer, even though she didn't mention it in the book?
Well, this is another thing. It's kind of like communism. So I was born in 1976, which is a year after Susan gets cancer. And I had never heard that cancer was something that was a punishment for a badly lived life. I really hadn't heard this. I feel like I've heard a lot of stuff. Definitely when she writes about AIDS, of course, I've heard that this is a kind of punishment for gay sex or for drug use. I'd never heard that about cancer. And I was really surprised how widespread this idea was that cancer was kind of a punishment. So when she gets cancer, she sees how people are actually dying because they're too ashamed even to go to their doctors or to get treatment because they feel like, oh, I brought this on myself. I better just suffer the consequences myself. And she saw this and she saw how stupid and perverse it was to condemn people to death when there was actually a lot of good cancer treatment. And she writes this book that becomes this really polemical book because it's so against the grain. I think when you read it now, you think, well, yeah, of course it's not. Of course it's not that like you should have had better sex and that's why you are dying.
Because she's arguing that there has been an image that repression or sexual repression or other kinds of repression somehow lead to disease, which she didn't invent. Of course, she's critiquing a much longer tradition that she thinks she kind of basically pinpoints starting with Freud and Wilhelm Reich, yeah?
Well, no, it starts with Galen. It starts in
true.
The ancient
But she focuses on them.
Even Freud and Reich, who were these great demystifiers, I mean, they created their own mystifications, of course, but even they believed this, and they did believe that the mind can produce the body. Freud literally believed that the mind could produce the body, which is a fascinating idea. And she was trying to take the blame away from it. She was trying to take the guilt. And it had this incredible reaction among people who were incredibly grateful to her for having said these things. But it's like photography. How does language pervert something? How does language deform an idea that actually is an idea that can kill you? Because you think, oh, how can my metaphor kill somebody? It's like, how can my poem help people in Bosnia? Well, she shows it in this incredibly detailed way how this operates. And it's one of the creepiest things about this book, among many very prophetic things about Sontag, is that all of these things that she's illustrating as kind of belonging to this medieval world of repression and stupidity, only a couple of years later, the first AIDS cases appear in the United States in 1981, in which this entire drama is reenacted. And so her critique of how language kills people becomes really scarily relevant. And I think it's an incredible book.
In many ways, I think that from your book, it emerges that she seems ahead of her time in terms of just a certain prescience about where social trends are going. One of the things that came out of the story that you tell about her illness, and illness as a metaphor, is that she emerges from it with at least an image, you write, I suppose consciously you write, her image of unshakable allegiance to science, because she kind of thinks to herself, well, it's because I completely place my faith in science that I was able to go for radical scientific treatments and get better. But that entailed, to make that decision, she had to, quote, not listen to anyone, only trust herself. And that's what saved her life. That was the center of her story. And this made me think of the visceral debates over science today. Where would she fall out? Would she fall out on the side of being devoted to science? Or would she fall out on the side of, I do my own research? I mean, I know it's unfair to ask you to try to project who she was.
It's exactly the same thing. I mean, it's exactly what she does. And of course, she's an extremely highly educated woman. She was not a scientist. She was not a doctor. So, there is a degree to which some of these things are natural. You want to take control. It's the mind and the body. The mind wants to take control back over the body. The thing is, what's so fascinating about it is she's denouncing this mystification, but she's actually creating a mystification of her own. I mean, what's really interesting is that she denounces things like smoking cigarettes she denounces people who denounce smoking cigarettes as, oh, that's just, as if that has anything to do with it.
Like victim blaming. She basically, what we would call today victim blaming.
Exactly. And I mean, we know that smoking creates cancer, at least in some people, quite a lot of people actually. But she really rejected any kind of external causes, because then it sounds like, you're blaming the victim for smoking. So you can't really get rid of mystifications without without putting another one in its place.
And can you try to imagine what kind of commentary she would have, for example, on the COVID debates or the anti-vaxxer debates, based on this kind of commitment to science, but also independent thinking?
I think the thing about the vax debate now that's so interesting is that we've gone into this place where the thing that she prized, which was the open mind, the life of, the intellectual learning of science, is actually being turned against a lot of people who are not as educated as she was, and who might have their own reasons for doing things. But people are seeing that science has a lot of answers, but doesn't have all the answers. And, or at least not yet. Eventually science does get a lot of things right. But I'd be very interested to see where she would fall in this debate. I mean, this is what I'm saying about liberals now, just yelling at people who don't agree with them. I mean, would she have done that? Probably. But I think also she would have been able to write something really interesting about this.
I wish we had her around now, but I also think that, as we pointed out, she was ahead of her time, and we are an Israeli show, so I want to point out that already in 1973, one of her independent and unusual positions was to be both pro-Israel. She stated that she was very supportive of Israel, but she comes to Israel in the middle of the war that would go down in history as the archetype of Israel's wars of defense. Maybe in the critic's eyes, its last war of defense. And she creates a film that is also very critical. And again, I'm quoting the book where you say she points out the moral degeneration abetted by imperial fantasies. She criticized Israel for being unconcerned about other people's suffering, things that people are saying today and generating a lot of controversy. How did she manage to be so independent-minded about it, and what was the response like?
Well, I think she had a position that was, I think, maybe easier for American Jews to have then than it was now. We're talking about 50 years ago, which was that you supported Israel, but you also could support Palestine. You could think, okay, well, these people need to work it out and just draw a line and build a wall, whatever, and let everybody go their own way. That film is really interesting because it is very pro-Israeli and it's also very pro-Palestinian, which is, I think, a position that people... I think it's typical of a Sontag position, that it's a complex position. It's not black and white. It's not one or the other. And I think because it didn't fit onto a spectrum, that film was kind of ignored. I definitely think it's her best film. I think it's on YouTube. People should watch it. It's called Promised Lands.
Yeah. We have to wrap up soon. I guess it would be impossible to talk about everything in her personal life, but I do want to try to get you to characterize what was the difficulty in her personal relationships. I know there were so many that you cover in the book, and I should also point out for our devoted listeners that we did have David Reef, her son, on the show just a few weeks ago. Not talking about her, talking about his own very prolific output. Why were her personal and most intimate relationships so troubled? And is there any through line between those that you can see in common?
Yeah, I mean, I think the through line, certainly with David and certainly with Annie Leibovitz and a lot of her girlfriends throughout her life, was something called hostile dependency, which is a psychological term that I really like because it gets at this so well. You're incredibly dependent. So she had these extremely intimate relationships. But at the same time, I think she resented the closeness. She resented the dependency because she was very attached to this idea of herself as a strong, independent person. And this created unbelievable tensions that are still there to this day. I mean, the tension between David and Annie is still definitely something that I had to navigate. I don't know how successfully, but it was very much. It was like Israel and Palestine, frankly, and it was just two irreconcilable things and two very important people in her life who really hate each other. And here's the poor biographer in the middle there. Two people who are very influential and both alive. It's different if you're writing a biography of Victor Hugo or somebody whose people might have hated each other, but they're not emailing you. But I think that Sontag I think this is just an inability to love other people in the way that she wanted to be loved. I found this very heartbreaking because I loved her, but at the same time, I was also really glad I didn't have to be in one of these relationships with her, because you hear the same story time and again about this incredible closeness and this admiration of this great woman. And then it eventually goes sour.
I feel like it's almost unfair to cut off the discussion of these personal relationships, but to wrap up, I want to get back to her thinking, I guess, and try to summarize it. One of the interesting things I think you point out is that she had remade herself really from the 60s, and you write that there was a period in the 70s, maybe part of the 80s, where she wasn't really sure where she was going, but by the 90s, let's say, she argued for the centrality of culture, and she became genuinely, I'm quoting you here, genuinely countercultural in a way that she never was in the 1960s. And I thought that was an interesting summary of her thinking and her intellectual life. And I want to ask you what you mean by that. How? Can we define her thinking? Is she a philosopher? Does she belong to any school of thought?
She's definitely a philosopher. I hope she doesn't belong to a school of thought, because what's so fascinating about Sontag is that she's so many things at so many different times in her life. And so the more you learn about her life and her writing, the more you really appreciate the breadth of what she did. I think when I say she's countercultural in the 90s, in the 60s, she had a very, very predictable line for somebody of her background. She was pro Castro, she was anti-Vietnam, this was all pretty predictable. Where she's very countercultural in the 60s, I think, is in the gay stuff, particularly Notes on Camp, which she then kind of backs away from. In the 90s, she becomes countercultural in two ways. First of all, she's resisting all these evil regimes, whether in Serbia or in Bosnia or in Cuba as well. And she's also really, I think her real contribution is she's resisting the stupidifying tendencies of American culture. She's resisting consumerism. She's resisting this kind of dumbing down of education. And I think the reason she's so loved is that a lot of people feel that way. A lot of Americans, a lot of people all around the world feel like, come on, people, is this really the best we can do? Is sitting on our phones all day, like watching, I like watching animal videos on YouTube, but surely there's got to be more.
You sure you don't want us to edit that out?
No, I'm totally in favor of animal videos on YouTube, but the mindlessness of American culture was increasingly hard to resist. And especially in the 90s, when America was triumphant, when America had won over everything and it reigned unchallenged as the greatest power in the world, you needed somebody like her to resist that.
Some people might think we still need someone like her, and I think your book is a great argument for that. Benjamin Moser, thank you for being on the show.
Sure, thanks. Great to talk to you.
You've been talking to us about Sontag, her life and work, which did win the Pulitzer Prize in 2020. Congratulations also. Thanks also to Itai Shelem, manager of TLV1 Studios, and to our producer Ariel Cohen and Roy Shelem for producing this episode. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have about 750 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow me and Gilad Halpern on Twitter, the Tel Aviv Review. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.